I spend a lot of time in this office, and I love saying hi and meeting new people. So if I can help you, or if I can help you figure out how you want to get involved on campus, please come by and let's talk.
Viewer discretion is advised for this educational documentary. Welcome back to Case Documentaries. If you didn't know, I post true crime, disturbing stories and other things you may later regret knowing. And I'm uploading daily until the end of the year. 50% of you watching this aren't yet subscribed, so double check that isn't you right now. My Patreon is linked below, however there's zero pressure from me. However, if your name is on screen right now, then you're a legend. Let's get straight into today's dark case. Eve Carson was born on November the 19th, 1985, and grew up in Athens, Georgia. Athens is a vibrant college town. It blends historic charm, thriving arts, and a rich music scene. Maybe the most notable band that comes from there is REM. Everyone that knew Eve said she was warm-hearted and kind. She would always go out of her way to help others, and was known as the friend that was everyone's go-to when they needed someone to listen. Eve also had always excelled academically. At high school, she became class president, throwing herself into planning events and advocating for student issues. She was on the academic team too, and vice president at the National Honor Society. No one knew how Eve could take on so much, with many different people commenting on her generosity with her time. Even with all her commitments, she still volunteered as a peer educator at a safe house for runaway teenagers. When she graduated high school, Eve had left a mark on both the school and her community. Her passion for learning and leadership then took her to the University of North Carolina, otherwise known as UNC, at Chapel Hill. Here she continued to excel academically, while throwing herself into everything that campus life had to offer. Eve was just as magnetic at college as she had been in high school. She'd always greet everyone with a smile. Before long, Eve was involved in student government, community outreach programs, and more volunteer work. She was determined to make a difference where she could. She quickly gained the same reputation, even in this new unfamiliar town, as she had back home, as someone who was deeply driven and compassionate. Her infectious spirit drew people to her, and she became widely known across campus. In her sophomore year, Eve was invited to join a competitive merit-based scholarship, one that emphasized leadership, service, and character. It was a celebration of everything that Eve had achieved so far. As she progressed through college, her focus expanded to issues affecting the UNC campus itself. She began advocating for fairer tuition rates, knowing that financial challenges were a barrier for some students. Understanding the struggles faced by students and working in student government ultimately made Eve decide to run for student body president, and she won in a landslide.
With 3,639 votes, Eve Carson is the student body president of the University of Nevada.
Right after the announcement, Carson told us that all the hard work finally paid off.
I look at it as the product of a lot of hard work and a really committed team. We put so much work into our ideas, into our research, and into just getting out there as much as possible to connect with students.
And so she poured herself into this new role, working long hours to fulfill her campaign promises and address students' concerns. As she always had, Eve also made sure that she committed herself fully to her studies. Even though she'd achieved so much, she never stopped thinking about what may come next. She started considering postgraduate programs, exploring ideas of public health, public policy, or law school so that she could continue making an impact on other people's lives. Eve brainstormed careers where she could blend scientific knowledge with her passion for service, daydreaming of medicine, or joining a humanitarian organization. She was only a year away from graduating and felt so excited at the prospect of her future. And so too did everyone around her, with her family, friends and professors all feeling proud. Everybody knew that Eve had big things ahead of her, which is why the events on the night of the 4th of March 2008 felt even more shocking, more heartbreaking. Eve's dreams would never be realized. After a night out with friends, Eve was heading to her car in Chapel Hill. Also out that night were two men named Demario James Atwater and Laurence Alvin Lovette Jr., but they weren't out to have a good time. They weren't celebrating or relaxing. They were hunting for prey. Lovette and Atwater were friends, and on that night, a third friend, a man named Jason McNeil, had declined to join them. Lovette had wanted McNeil to drive he and Atwater around, not exactly an exciting prospect. So with the lack of a friend with a car, Lovette, who was on probation for burglary, instead took his own mother's car and drove with Atwater to Chapel Hill. The two were scoping the local area for a victim, someone that they could take from rather than working to achieve something for themselves. And that is when they saw Eve Carson. She was returning to her car, ready to go home after a night out. As she opened the car door, the two men came up behind her and forced her and themselves into the car. Lovette got into the driver's seat, whilst Atwater sat in the back holding Eve hostage. Eve understandably started shaking and crying. She pleaded with them to let her go. She told them that they could take anything of hers that they wanted, if they could just make sure that she got out of the car safely. Her captors drove her immediately to an ATM. First they went to one at University Mall in Chapel Hill, where they withdrew $700. They then went to another ATM in Durham, but they couldn't withdraw any more money. Eve tried to reason with them both. She said that they didn't need to do what they were doing. She still couldn't stop crying. This was so far from the world that she knew. She started pleading with them to take her back to campus. After all, they had the money, and this must have been the reason that they were doing this. But Eve's desperate pleas fell on deaf ears. After the second attempt at the ATM, Lovette and Atwater started driving to a wooded neighborhood. This was about a mile from campus. At this moment, Eve started to realize how unlikely it was that they were just going to let her go. The trees at this location were thick and tightly packed together. Eve begged them over and over again to turn around, but Lovette and Atwater had already made their choice. Eve had seen both of their faces, and they didn't trust that she wouldn't immediately report them for the armed robbery. And Lovette was on probation after all. If he got caught now, he will be going away for a very, very long time. As the car slowed to a halt, there was darkness all around them. The firearm was still at Eve's head. She quietly realized what was about to happen. She knew that she couldn't change their minds, that even with all of her finely honed communication skills, they wouldn't help now, not with these people. So incredibly, Eve stopped asking for them to let her go, but instead she asked if the two would pray with her, seeking some form of solace in what she believed was some of her final moments. Please, she begged. Eve couldn't stop her body shaking. They made her walk deeper and deeper into the woods, tears streaming down her cheeks. Eve was thinking of all the dreams ahead of her that she still wanted to fulfill. She asked the pair one more time not to do this. Instead of answering her though, Lovette and Atwater instead pulled the trigger 5 times whilst aimed directly at her. During the first 4, Eve was still alive, witnessing her own demise in real time. They targeted her right shoulder, her right upper arm, right buttock and right cheek. Vital fluids in her lungs showed she was still breathing at this point. Eve had spent her whole life trying to protect other people, and she knew that in this moment, the only small chance she had would be to protect herself too. The final shot was fired. Eve raised her right hand in self-defense, but instead of it stopping the bullet, it went straight through to her right temple and then her brain. There was nothing more she could do. In that instant, all of Eve's dreams disappeared. Lovette and Atwater left her body behind. However, they did take her bank card as they ran back to her car. They then drove as fast as they could away from the scene. It wasn't long until a woman who lived close by reported hearing gunshots to the police. They immediately drove to the area that the woman described, and after combing through the woods for a short while, there they found Eve, laying cold on the ground. Authorities contacted the Carson family to let them know what had happened. Eve's parents refused to believe the police at first. How could this be the same daughter who had done so much, yet still had so much ahead of her? They were silent with shock. Likewise, as the news spread, students on campus were devastated. Eve's friends, family, and classmates struggled to comprehend the senselessness of her death. Her absence was instantly, deeply felt. In the meantime, the Chapel Hill Police Department acted quickly. They could feel the weight of the tragedy immediately bearing down onto them. Police knew that they would be under pressure not only to deliver justice, but to help a grieving community make sense of the seemingly nonsensical. People were fearful knowing that the killers were still at large. Could this happen again? Could this happen to them? The first priority was to piece together the events of the night. The reports of the gunshot were made in the early morning, and other neighbours, when interviewed, also mentioned that they'd seen a car, one that seemed like it didn't belong in the area. Officers began a systematic search for evidence, and investigators canvassed nearby areas for potential witnesses or for any footage that may shed more light onto Eve's final hours. It would be greed that would reveal the first breakthrough in the case. It was the withdrawals from the ATM that Lovette and Atwater made that became the first big lead in the case. They traced the withdrawals made from Eve's cards back to 2 ATM locations, and then they tracked down the CCTV. It showed 2 individuals in the car with Eve, and it showed them using her card to withdraw money. Although the images were grainy, there was enough that they could go on. The images were released to the public, asking anyone who had any information to come forward immediately. And then the next break came from the calls that started pouring in following the footage's release. One tip led them to Atwater, who had previous encounters with the police, and his appearance matched one of the men in the ATM footage. Following the lead, the police dug more into Atwater's background and friends. This took them directly to Lovette, who also fit the second man on the tapes. The police held their breath. They knew now they were getting very close. But every day they also saw the community still grieving for Eve. They knew that they couldn't get this wrong. Carefully, behind closed doors, the police began to build a case. On March 12, 2008, Atwater was charged with first-degree murder. He was 21 years old at the time. The next day, Lovette, 17, was also arrested. There was a sense of relief, a sense that justice may be served. The court appearances were somber, however. The age of the men made everything even more senseless. It seemed their lives were the complete opposite of Eve Carson. Atwater pled guilty, receiving life in prison plus 30 years. He apologized in court to Eve's parents, turning to them and saying, "No matter what the court did today, it would be far from anything I should receive." Eve's parents couldn't speak during the hearing. They were still in disbelief that the young man in front of them was the very same person that had ended their daughter's life. Although Lovette pleaded not guilty, the jury found him otherwise. Lovette was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The community rallied together to honour Eve's memory. Vigils were held on campus before and after the sentencing, and there memories of Eve were shared, of all the times she had helped and inspired other people. A scholarship was started in her name, so that her legacy could continue to support future generations of students. And in the years since, that legacy has only grown. In 2009, an American Idol finalist who was a friend of Eve talked about how her faith in him had pushed him to the audition, even though she was no longer around. This contestant was a man named Anoop Desai, otherwise known as Totem. An annual Memorial 5K is also held in her honour. It raises money each year for charity. Her university also dedicated a garden to Eve and to other students who passed away before their graduation. I think from what we know about Eve, that seems very much something she would have wanted, not to take the limelight for herself, but to share it with other lost souls. In that garden, people can sit in quiet peace, listen to birdsong, or look at the monument with the words inscribed on it. learned from every single being, experience, and moment. In many small ways, Eve does live on. Make sure you're subscribed and hit like if you appreciate what I'm doing here. I'd love to see your thoughts and see your discussions about this case down in the comments. And remember, I am posting daily for the rest of the year, so don't miss out. Be careful out there, and I'll see you soon.